There is a moment, typically sometime after 40, when we catch our reflection unexpectedly. It might be in a store window, or perhaps in the quiet glass of the bathroom mirror late at night. We see the familiar lines of age, the subtle changes in the shape of the face. That is expected. But sometimes, what catches us is a deeper sense of unfamiliarity. It is the look in the eyes. It is the realization that the life we are living, the person carrying the weight of the everyday routine, feels fundamentally separate from the self we remember inhabiting this space 10 or 15 years ago. We look at this mature face, this functional adult, and the internal question surfaces quietly, sometimes almost painfully. Where did I go? This feeling of dislocation is one of the deepest, most universal internal conflicts of midlife, and yet it is rarely spoken about openly. We are accustomed to discussing external struggles, financial stress, relationship friction, career demands. But the internal landscape, the slow, silent drift away from our own identity, remains mostly private territory. Many of us arrive at this point having diligently followed the maps provided by society. We pursued education, sought stable employment, managed responsibilities, maybe started a family, or built significant professional authority. We did the required things. We were successful by the common definition. And often, that is precisely the core of the quiet confusion. If I built this solid, stable life, why does the act of living it feel so exhausting? Not physically exhausted, though that happens too, but emotionally depleted. It is a slow leak of energy driven by the constant effort required to maintain a structure that no longer feels entirely true. The exhaustion of midlife is often the exhaustion of maintenance. We are maintaining routines, maintaining relationships, maintaining a reputation, maintaining a facade of competence and control. This daily upkeep consumes the very emotional resources needed for exploration or joy. We become masters of the subtle art of emotional rationing. We give out just enough energy to fulfill obligations, leaving little or nothing in reserve for the self that needs tending. We postpone reflection, thinking we will get to it when things calm down. But things never truly calm down. The responsibilities simply shift shape. This leads directly to the silent frustration. It is a specific kind of disappointment that cannot easily be voiced because the world offers no context for it. How do you explain to others that you are deeply unsatisfied when, objectively, you have so much to be grateful for? The mind rebels against this paradox. It tries to dismiss the feeling as petulance or ingratitude. But the disappointment is real. It is the realization that the goals we spent 2 decades pursuing, the goals that promised contentment upon arrival, did not deliver the internal shift we expected. We achieved the prize, only to find the container empty. This feeling of having done everything right, only to end up feeling profoundly lost, is psychologically difficult to reconcile. It suggests that the entire framework we relied on for measuring our lives was flawed. And if the framework was flawed, what does that say about the foundation we built everything upon? This is where the psychological changes of midlife truly begin to bite. In our 20s and 30s, the primary drivers were typically achievement and acquisition. We focused on becoming someone, on proving our worth, on accumulating resources, status, and experience. Excitement was the fuel. Novelty was the reward. But around the age of 40, that currency begins to devalue internally. The excitement of a promotion or a new possession lasts only a short time. The mind, having checked off the major milestones, starts shifting its focus inward, almost involuntarily. The question changes from, what do I want to achieve next, to, what does all of this mean? This transition from the pursuit of excitement to the search for meaning is jarring, primarily because the structures of our daily life were built for the younger self, the self obsessed with achievement. The job that was once thrilling now feels like a repetitive mechanism. The routines that ensured stability now feel like bars on a cage. The old definitions of identity begin to crumble. Identity, especially in the modern world, is often tied closely to function. Our role as a parent, a partner, a professional, a provider. When those roles feel less invigorating, the identity anchored to them starts to feel thin and precarious. We look in the mirror and see the person defined by these functions, but we no longer recognize the person who chose them, or perhaps the person who existed before. Those functions took over entirely. The original self, the self with distinct, perhaps impractical dreams and passions, seems to have been outsourced, put into storage while the competent adult took the helm. The conflict arises because we cannot simply dismantle our lives. The structures we built are often beneficial, even necessary, for others we care about. We are tied by loyalty, by financial obligation, and by sheer habit. So, we continue the performance, suppressing the growing sense that we are living someone else's well-organized itinerary. This internal suppression requires immense psychological effort. We must constantly manage the dissonance between the successful outer life and the dissatisfied inner reality. This is why many people in this stage of life find themselves drifting toward emotional numbness. Numbness is a form of self-protection. If we stop feeling the deep disappointment, we can continue to function without having to make the terrifying choices required to realign our lives. But the price of numbness is steep. It dulls the edges of pain, certainly, but it also dulls the capacity for genuine joy, connection, and presence. We might be present physically, sitting at the dinner table or leading a meeting, but internally, we are elsewhere, observing our own life as if watching a mildly interesting, slightly frustrating film. This sense of being lost, even when standing firmly on solid ground, is a unique burden of maturity. Younger people feel lost because they haven't yet found the path. We feel lost because we followed the path faithfully, arrived at the destination, and realized we don't belong here. The first step in navigating this phase is radical honesty about the disappointment. Not the disappointment aimed at specific people or events, but the disappointment aimed at the narrative we were sold and the narrative we sold ourselves. The life script that promised fulfillment based on external indicators, the right house, the right title, the right relationship status, was incomplete. It focused entirely on the first half of the journey. We must accept the reality that the self who started this journey is not the self who finished it. We have changed. Our values have matured. What defined success at 30 feels irrelevant at 50. The energy that once drove ambition now yearns for depth, authenticity, and peace. The shift is often invisible to those around us. Our partner might not notice. Our colleagues certainly won't, because our outward efficiency remains high. The crisis is not external. It is deep within the internal machinery of our being. It is the core operating system demanding an upgrade that requires shutting down all current operations. The danger here is not failure, but stagnation. It is the fear that we will remain frozen in this state of competent, yet hollow existence until the end. We worry that the time for rediscovery has passed, that we are too old, too entrenched, or too tired to rebuild the inner architecture. But the quiet frustration is, in its own way, a profound gift. It is the internal signal, often the only signal, that the soul is still alive and demanding attention. The lack of recognition in the mirror is not a sign of failure. It is an indication that the external structures have suffocated the internal self, and that the time for reclamation has arrived. We are forced, in midlife, to confront the difference between identity and purpose. Identity is who we are according to others and our roles. Purpose is the internal drive, the reason we get up in the morning, which transcends roles and external validation. When we feel lost, it usually means we have been relying exclusively on identity, allowing purpose to wither. Reclaiming that purpose does not usually require dramatic external revolution. It rarely means quitting the job or dissolving the marriage immediately. It means beginning the quiet, intentional work of prioritizing the internal landscape over the external presentation. It means recognizing that the time we spend worrying about being seen as successful is time stolen from being genuinely fulfilled. The goal shifts from impressing the outside world to satisfying the quiet needs of the self that we found missing. This internal work starts with dismantling the layers of expectation. We have to identify which behaviors, preferences, and commitments belong to the person we are now, and which belong to the ghost of the person we felt we should become. Often, we are still carrying commitments made by a much younger, less informed version of ourselves. And those commitments act as emotional anchors, holding us back long after the tide has changed. Psychologically, this is the phase where we must learn to tolerate disappointment. Not just the disappointment in our lives, but the disappointment of others. When we begin to reclaim our energy and set boundaries around our time, those who benefited from our prior level of overfunctioning will inevitably push back. They expected the reliable, exhausted person to continue performing the role. The resistance from the external world is a crucial test of our commitment to our internal well-being. If we immediately capitulate to avoid conflict, we send a clear message to ourselves that the needs of the outside world still supersede the quiet, desperate needs of the person in the mirror. This requires a profound shift in how we define self-worth. For decades, our worth was likely tied to productivity, utility, and sacrifice. The more we gave, the more valuable we felt, even if we were running on fumes. Now, the task is to recognize our inherent worth, independent of what we produce or provide for others. This is acceptance, but it is not resignation. Resignation is giving up on the possibility of change. Acceptance is acknowledging the reality of our current emotional state and the limitations of our current structures, using that clarity as the foundation for building something more genuine. Clarity without illusion is the hallmark of this mature phase. We stop pretending that radical transformation is just around the corner. We stop chasing quick fixes or believing in sudden epiphanies. Instead, we commit to the slow, deliberate work of small adjustments. These adjustments, applied consistently, are what eventually shift the trajectory of a life. For many, the first small adjustment involves simply standing still, long enough to hear the quiet voice that has been drowned out by the noise of achievement. We have become so good at doing that, we have forgotten how to simply be. And the voice of the person we lost is often found not in shouting, but in the silence. When we allow ourselves quiet time, free of external input, the internal conflicts surface immediately. The mind, accustomed to distraction, will try to fill the void with anxieties, to-do lists, and worry. Learning to sit through that discomfort is essential. It is the psychological equivalent of draining the swamp before rebuilding the house. We have to observe the chaos before we can organize it. This process forces us to confront the reality of time. When we were younger, time felt limitless, elastic. Now, the finite nature of time imposes a pressure that can be paralyzing, but also clarifying. We can no longer afford to waste years pursuing goals that are not ours. The midlife clock focuses the mind wonderfully, forcing us to ask, what truly matters? Now, given the time I realistically have left? The answers that emerge are often simple, stripped of the complexity and high expectations of youth. They are rarely about material accumulation or grand gestures. They are about depth of connection, genuine contribution, presence, and simple, profound peace. To reconcile the person we are with the person we see in the mirror, we must stop trying to resuscitate the past self. That self served its purpose, achieving the stability we enjoy today. The goal is not to go back and find the 25-year-old self, but to introduce the 45-year-old self to a future that is defined by authenticity, not obligation. The internal shift is about moving from external validation to internal verification. We stop asking, "Does this look good to my peers?" and start asking, "Does this feel true to me?" This internal verification process is messy and requires courage, because often, what feels true is quiet, unremarkable, and completely contrary to the expectations we have internalized over decades. This is the difficult, beautiful psychological work of the second half of life. Learning to live unapologetically, within the constraints of reality, while simultaneously expanding the internal space for genuine self-expression. It is the journey from success as defined by the calendar to meaning as defined by the soul. The exhaustion we speak of at this stage is rarely just physical fatigue. It is the deep psychic weariness that comes from decades of managing a perception. For the first half of life, we are primarily concerned with output and visibility. We operate on a map where safety, success, and even love are tied to achievement and the external narrative we present. We become masters of presentation. We learn how to appear capable, secure, and always in control. But that level of constant performance requires an unsustainable amount of energy. Around 40, the cost of maintaining the flawless narrative suddenly exceeds the benefit it provides. The armor we crafted to protect ourselves in the ISO world becomes too heavy to wear. This is when you start to resent the life you built. Not because the components are bad, but because the maintenance demands are crushing. The resentment stems from the realization that you have been pouring vast amounts of effort into something that no longer feeds you, something that actually drains the source. The soul, if you listen closely, is whispering, or perhaps screaming, "I am tired of proving I exist." This leads directly to one of the most isolating experiences of midlife, the silent frustration. It is the frustration of looking at a life that, on paper, is successful. A comfortable home, a stable career, a measure of security, and feeling profoundly disappointed. This disappointment is so often silent because it feels unacceptable. It feels ungrateful. We look at the world and see genuine suffering, and we feel deep shame that we are emotionally starving in a comfortable cage. We believe we have no right to complain because we followed the instructions. We did the required reading. We passed the tests, and yet the final certificate feels fundamentally meaningless. We are disappointed, not in the lack of life, but in the quality of the feeling it provides. This is a critical psychological moment. It signals that the metrics we used for validation in our 20s and 30s are now obsolete. They were necessary tools for building a foundation, but they are terrible tools for determining internal worth. What happens in our 40s is a quiet, internal reckoning with identity. We realize that for many years, our sense of self was largely an accumulation of roles: the efficient professional, the dedicated parent, the supportive partner, the reliable friend. These roles provided structure and constant external feedback. They told us who we were by telling us what we did, but they did not necessarily reflect the true core self. When we look in the mirror and fail to recognize the person staring back, it is usually because we are seeing the exhaustion of the accumulated roles, not the underlying human being. We are seeing a manager of complex logistics, not the person who used to dream quietly in the margins. The psychological shift required now is profound. It demands that we reverse the direction of validation. We must stop asking the world, "Who am I?" and instead start answering that question ourselves. This often means stepping into spaces that feel smaller, quieter, and less spectacular than the roles we have grown accustomed to shedding. The rewards of self-recognition are entirely internal. They do not generate applause. For many years, the driving force was ambition fueled by external reward. We chased the next milestone, the next title, the next level of security. This chase provided excitement, a sense of momentum, and a clear path. But somewhere along the way, often around 45, the fuel changes. The desire for excitement fades. Excitement is high energy, high risk, and requires constant novelty. What replaces it is the much quieter, deeper yearning for meaning. Meaning is the opposite of excitement. Meaning is low energy, low risk, and requires profound repetition and presence. It is found not in the next big thing, but in the depth of commitment to the things already here. The conflict arises because we are psychologically wired for the chase. We spent decades being told that inertia is the enemy. Now, we are asked to sit still, to observe the mundane, and to excavate the truth from the debris of our old ambitions. This process is terrifying because sitting still feels like failing. We worry that if we stop pushing, the entire carefully constructed life will collapse. The primary conflict that mature people rarely talk about is this internal pressure to maintain the illusion of perpetual forward momentum, even when every fiber of their being yearns for integration and rest. We are psychologically trapped between the need to keep producing and the need to simply exist. Consider the energy spent on the routine of work, the routine of maintenance, the routine of relationships. In youth, routine can feel like stability, a necessary framework for adventure. In midlife, routine can feel like a cage made of predictable days. The key is realizing that the routine itself is neutral. It is the attitude we bring to it that determines whether it is a cage or a container. If the routine is performed out of obligation, purely to maintain the external narrative, it is exhausting. If the routine is adopted as a container for focused internal presence, as the structure that holds the space for meaningful small actions, then it becomes a source of quiet power. Acceptance is a word often misunderstood at this stage of life. People confuse acceptance with resignation. They hear the need to accept reality and believe it means giving up hope, settling for less, or allowing mediocrity to reign. True acceptance is not giving up the struggle. It is changing the nature of the struggle. Resignation says, "This is all there is, and I hate it." Acceptance says, "This is what is real right now, and I will meet it exactly as it is, without illusion, so I can respond effectively." Acceptance is the necessary precursor to clarity. Until we stop fighting the reality of our current limitations, the limitations of time, energy, and opportunity, we spend all our resources fighting ghosts. The deep psychological work of the 40s and 50s is learning to honor the reality of constraints. We have to acknowledge that some doors are permanently closed, not due to failure, but due to the simple passage of time. The body cannot recover the way it once did. The career trajectory we once envisioned may have fundamentally changed. The relationship dynamics are fixed, for better or worse, in certain patterns. When we accept the constraint, the fight stops. The energy released from that fight can then be redirected toward expansion within the boundaries. Clarity without illusion means seeing yourself and your life with absolute, unflinching honesty. It means acknowledging the disappointments you hold, the mistakes you made, and the emotional baggage you carry, without using them as weapons against yourself. The illusion of youth is often that the next major event will solve all the persistent problems. The new job, the new city, the new relationship. Clarity teaches us that the problems follow us because the persistent problems are internal, not environmental. The only thing that changes is the internal landscape. Midlife is the time when the gap between who you believe you should be and who you actually are becomes painfully wide. The person you should be is a construct, built by societal expectations and youthful idealism. The person you are is the real complicated human being dealing with mortgage payments and chronic exhaustion. The journey toward genuine self-expression requires slowly dismantling the shoulds. Every time you act based on obligation rather than quiet conviction, you reinforce the gap. Every time you prioritize external appearance over internal peace, you move further away from yourself. This is the psychological test of the second half of life. Can you afford to be unremarkable? Can you allow your actions to be motivated by internal resonance rather than the anticipation of external approval? For many of us who built successful lives, our identity is deeply intertwined with being seen as competent, driven, and impressive. Letting go of that need to impress is terrifying. It feels like stepping off a high wire without a net. But the relief that comes from ceasing the performance is immense. It is the relief of simply being heavy, grounded, and quiet. We must learn to distinguish between genuine purpose and elaborate distraction. Sometimes the search for a capital P purpose is simply an elaborate way to avoid sitting with the small, uncomfortable truths of the present moment. Purpose is often found, not created. It is discovered by observing what you genuinely care about, what holds your attention, and what you are willing to repeat, even if no one is watching or applauding. It is usually woven into the fabric of the existing routine, disguised as simple care. It is the commitment to doing small things well. It is the presence you bring to a conversation, the attention you give to a neglected garden, the discipline you apply to a difficult craft. These small commitments aggregate into a life that feels authentic, even if it lacks the dramatic arcs of the first half. The emotional exhaustion lifts when we stop trying to live two lives simultaneously: the life that is externally validated and the life that is internally felt. When those two paths converge, the energy that was wasted on conflict and management is finally freed up for genuine living. This convergence is not achieved through grand transformation. It is achieved through incremental, often boring, acts of honesty. It is the slow, deliberate work of choosing what is real over what is impressive. The ultimate measure of success in this second phase is simple: the reduction of internal friction. When your values align with your actions, when your internal conversation is kind, and when your external demands match your internal capacity, you find a deep, quiet peace. This peace is not the absence of problems. It is the presence of self. But even when we find that presence, the world does not stop spinning. In fact, after 40, the spinning often gets faster, or at least, the centrifugal force becomes harder to manage. We are expected to maintain the life we built in our 30s while simultaneously planning for the life we must inhabit in our 60s. This is the era of maximum sustained pressure. The mortgage is still heavy. The career demands peak performance. The children require deep guidance or, ironically, deep financial support. And then there are the parents, beginning their slow, inevitable decline. We become the hinge point, supporting the generation below and the generation above. This constant supporting role exacts a profound cost. Not just time, but identity. The self that was once vibrant, curious, or ambitious starts to disappear behind the roles. The provider, the caregiver, the manager, the mediator. You look up one day and realize that every single decision you make, every hour you spend, is in service of maintaining the structure around you, not nourishing the self inside. This isn't just physical tiredness that a weekend can fix. It is the deep, cold exhaustion of the spirit. It's what happens when you spend a decade running on emotional reserves you never knew you had, and now the tank is completely dry. We confuse being busy with being productive, and we mistake maintaining commitments for having purpose. In midlife, the distinction between these things is crucial. Being busy is often simply a frantic effort to keep the spinning plates from crashing. Having purpose is the quiet, internal knowledge that the plates you are spinning are the ones that actually matter to you. When we lose sight of that distinction, disappointment settles in. It rarely arrives with a dramatic fanfare. It usually presents as a slow, creeping doubt, a silent frustration that you cannot quite place. Everything on the checklist is marked off. The life looks objectively successful to the outside world. Yet, internally, there is a hollowness. This is the psychological state of doing everything right, but feeling completely wrong. The conflict here is deeply rooted in the expectations we absorbed in our youth. We were taught that success was linear. Work hard, delay gratification, achieve stability, and then you will be happy. But life after 40 reveals that stability is often just a very complex machine that requires constant, exhausting maintenance. The happiness promised never arrives in the form we expected. It doesn't look like excitement or exhilaration. It looks like quiet relief, punctuated by moments of genuine connection. When we realize this, the young, ambitious self feels cheated. That younger self is still inside us, screaming, "Is this all there is?" We must gently, firmly tell that younger self that yes, perhaps this is all there is, but that all contains a depth and reality the 20-year-old could never appreciate. The shift required is one of orientation. We move from seeking expansion to seeking essence. We stop trying to add more things to our lives and start trying to remove the things that drain our energy unnecessarily. This removal process is where the true, difficult work of midlife identity begins. It requires saying no to things that are good, but not good for us. It means ending relationships that are comfortable but static. It means accepting that some parts of our identity, the party personality, the relentless high achiever, the people pleaser, have served their purpose and must now be retired. When we reach this level of emotional depletion, silence becomes dangerous. We may start to harbor a quiet, simmering resentment toward the very people and commitments we chose. We feel guilty for feeling this way, which only pushes the resentment further underground. This is the silent killer of connection and peace. The only antidote is the slow, deliberate reclamation of space. Not necessarily physical space, but emotional margin. We must learn, perhaps for the first time, that selfishness and self-preservation are not the same thing. Self-preservation is the fundamental psychological necessity that allows us to stay present and compassionate. Without it, we become brittle. Midlife is a constant negotiation with what is truly necessary. Our 20s were about acquisition, acquiring skills, partners, possessions, status. Our 40s become about divestment. We must look at every commitment, every relationship, every habit, and ask, does this require more from me than it gives back? Or does it genuinely enrich the core of who I am? If the answer is a persistent imbalance, then we have to find the quiet strength to let go. This letting go is often mistaken for resignation. It is not. Resignation is giving up on the possibility of a better life. Acceptance, paired with action, is recognizing the limitations of reality while optimizing the possibilities within those limitations. It is the radical honesty of saying, I have finite energy, and I will spend it where it truly matters, even if that disappoints someone else. The psychological change here is profound because it challenges our fundamental need to be liked, to be necessary, and to be perceived as successful by external metrics. We are finally forced to confront the internal metrics. The internal metrics are subtle. They measure the depth of your sleep, the quality of your small daily interactions, the absence of that nagging tension in your shoulders, and the simple relief of not having to perform or pretend. These are the true measures of a well-lived midlife. They are invisible to the world, and that is their power. To move toward this deeper clarity, we must first address the internal conflicts that we rarely speak about openly. One of the largest conflicts is the realization that the primary engine of our life, ambition, has often run out of fuel, or at least the type of fuel it runs on has changed. The ambition of youth is driven by recognition and advancement. The ambition of maturity is driven by competence and contribution. When we try to force the old, flashy ambition onto the new reality, we experience deep internal friction. We chase promotions we don't actually want, or status symbols that feel hollow the moment we acquire them. The goal shifts from climbing the ladder to determining whether the ladder is leaned against the right wall. If you are feeling lost after 40, it is often because you have successfully climbed a ladder that you now realize was placed against the wrong building altogether. The temptation is to tear the whole structure down, to make a radical, impulsive change, a job change, a geographic move, a sudden relationship break. But true change in midlife is rarely explosive. It is usually incremental and quiet. It is the slow, deliberate realignment of our daily habits with our core values. This realignment begins with observation, not judgment. We must act as a compassionate observer of our own lives. Where do I routinely feel energized? And where do I routinely feel drained? Who are the people who leave me feeling lighter, and who are the people who leave me feeling heavy? When we apply this quiet observation, we often discover that the greatest source of exhaustion is not the job itself, but the constant masking we do while performing the job. It is not the family obligation, but the inability to communicate simple boundaries within that obligation. The weariness is rarely caused by the reality of the task. It is caused by the resistance to the reality of the task. Acceptance here means dropping the resistance. It means accepting that life is messy, that people are flawed, and that our own capacity is limited. This is not pessimistic. It is profoundly freeing. When we accept our limits, we finally stop measuring ourselves against an impossible standard of perfection and start working effectively within the confines of our actual human life. This journey toward clarity requires a fundamental redefinition of success. We stop seeing success as the accumulation of external markers and start seeing it as the mastery of the internal landscape. Can I regulate my emotions under pressure? Can I communicate my needs honestly and kindly? Can I feel contentment while sitting still? These questions, seemingly small, lead to the biggest psychological shifts of all. They move us away from the performance of life and into the experience of it. For many people, the hardest part of this midlife realization is dealing with the disappointment directed at their former self. The disappointment that they didn't make different choices, that they wasted time, or that they followed advice that turned out to be wrong. Holding on to this regret is like drinking poison and expecting the past to feel better. We must understand that the person we were 10 or 20 years ago made the best decisions they could with the information and emotional maturity they possessed at the time. Judging that past self harshly serves only to paralyze the present self. We must practice a deliberate, active form of self-compassion. The mature self needs to become the wise, understanding parent to the younger, striving self. You acknowledge the pain, you validate the effort, and you shift the focus entirely to what is possible right now. The power of midlife is not in changing the trajectory of the past, but in finally claiming full ownership of the present moment. This ownership is the bedrock of identity after 40. It is recognizing that the mirror reflects a person who has endured, who has learned, and who is now finally ready to define life on her own terms, terms that prioritize depth over breadth and honesty over appearance. This quiet clarity is the ultimate reward for navigating the necessary turbulence of this profound season of life. This quiet clarity is the ultimate reward for navigating the necessary turbulence of this profound season of life. The turbulence itself often manifests as a form of deep, persistent exhaustion. It is not merely physical fatigue that a long weekend can cure. It is soul exhaustion, born from decades spent maintaining a structure that wasn't primarily built for our own authenticity, but for the approval and expectation of others. We reach midlife carrying the heavy inventory of obligations, roles, and definitions provided by the outside world. We were promised that if we followed the prescribed path, the right career, the stable relationship, the achievement milestones, that fulfillment would automatically follow. When we arrive at that destination, having diligently checked every box, and find the promised. Emotion is absent. The resulting silence is often deafening. This absence of feeling is what triggers the internal crisis, because it forces us to question the entire foundation of our past efforts. This realization rarely erupts into dramatic external rebellion. For the mature person, it often settles in as a cold, quiet disappointment with the script they followed so faithfully. We begin to feel lost, not because we failed, but because we succeeded at something that ultimately did not sustain us. This is the heavy price of success built on borrowed values. The psychological energy required to sustain a life that does not align with our internal truth is enormous. It is the energy of performance, of filtering every genuine reaction through a lens of social acceptability. After 40, the cost of this performance becomes unbearable. Our internal system starts demanding payment in the form of deep, unshakable apathy or persistent anxiety. This is why, psychologically, we experience a fundamental shift in our driving force. We stop asking, "How can I achieve more success?" and start asking, "What does all this actually mean?" The adrenaline rush that fuels ambition in our 20s and 30s begins to dissipate. The pursuit of expansion, more money, more influence, more things, suddenly feels hollow. We crave contraction, we seek simplicity, we demand depth. The energy spent competing, performing, or keeping pace with younger colleagues or peers who are still running the early race suddenly seems too expensive to trade for our finite time. This recognition is painful because it means admitting that significant past efforts might have been misdirected, or that we prioritize the measurable over the meaningful. The work of midlife identity, therefore, becomes one of subtraction, not addition. It is about intelligently shedding the things that drain us, regardless of their perceived external value. We look at our routines, our commitments, even some of our oldest relationships, and ask a brutal, honest question. Does this still serve the person I am now, or am I maintaining it only to honor the person I used to be, or the role others assigned me? This process of shedding can be mistaken for cynicism or bitterness, especially by those who benefit from our old habits. But from the inside, it is an act of profound self-preservation. It is realizing that strength after 40 is found not in accumulating obligations, but in the intelligent refusal to engage with what actively diminishes our spirit. We must learn to accept that disappointing others is sometimes a necessary step toward stopping the lifelong pattern of disappointing ourselves. This is perhaps the hardest lesson of maturity, recognizing that our peace is often in direct conflict with someone else's comfort. The internal conflict during this phase centers heavily on control. For years, we operated under the illusion that if we controlled our environment, our career, and our closest relationships, we could control our happiness. Midlife often breaks this illusion completely. It shows us that control is exhaustive, and frequently, ineffective. True psychological freedom arrives when we move from the exhaustion of trying to control external outcomes to the quiet power of choosing our internal response. This shift is the definition of mature responsibility. It is recognizing that while we cannot change the trajectory of the past, we can define the value of the present. This leads us to the critical distinction between acceptance and resignation. Many people fear the word acceptance, believing it implies giving up, sinking into apathy, or simply tolerating a less than ideal life. That is resignation. Acceptance, conversely, is an active, powerful stance. It is the honest acknowledgement of reality exactly as it is, stripped of our emotional demands or historical grievances. It is accepting the limits of our influence. We cannot rewind the clock. We cannot force growth onto a difficult partner, and we cannot erase the consequences of choices made long ago. By accepting these immutable facts, we stop spending psychological resources on the fight. We stop trying to solve problems that cannot be solved by brute force or wishful thinking. That energy, once tied up in resistance, is suddenly freed. This is the resource we use to build the remaining structure of our lives on honest, solid ground. We stop trying to live an idealized life and finally start living the actual one. The person we see in the mirror after 40 is often startling because she has endured. She is less malleable, less willing to smile just to keep the peace. There is a hardness there, yes, but it is the hardness of a diamond, formed under immense pressure, and now reflective of its own light, not the light cast upon it by others. This internal reconfiguration changes how we view time. In the first half of life, time felt expansive, a resource to be spent carelessly on experimentation and ambition. After 40, time reveals itself as the finite, ultimate currency. We become ruthless with its allocation. This ruthlessness is not selfish. It is simply realizing the stakes are higher now. Every hour spent doing something meaningless or soul-draining is an hour stolen from the life we genuinely want to inhabit. This is why many mature adults find their tolerance for superficiality plummets. We no longer have the patience for small talk that requires emotional labor but offers no depth. We gravitate toward the few relationships where we can drop the filter, where silence is comfortable, and where vulnerability is met with respect, not judgment. These small, deep pockets of authentic connection become the necessary anchors against the vast, sometimes turbulent waters of midlife. The quiet revolution of this age is often invisible to the outside world. It is not about grand gestures or dramatic career changes, though those things sometimes follow. The real work is internal. The steady, deliberate dismantling of the internal critic that was built on external expectations. We are finally learning to judge ourselves based on integrity rather than achievement. Integrity at this stage means congruence, the alignment between what we say we value and how we actually spend our time, our energy, and our money. If we claim to value peace, but constantly seek out conflict or high-stress environments, there is a fundamental psychological dissonance that leads back to exhaustion. Clarity is the slow, painstaking process of closing that gap. It is a difficult realization that we are the only ones responsible for maintaining this coherence. No external event, no promotion, no partner, no amount of money will ever grant it to us. It is an inside job, built brick by brick through small, honest choices made every day. The disappointment with life after 40 often stems from this realization. We were waiting for life to deliver happiness, when happiness was always dependent on our willingness to define and build it ourselves, regardless of external circumstances. The key emotional shift is moving away from the hope of a perfect future and settling into the reality of a sufficient present. The constant pursuit of better often prevents us from truly inhabiting the good enough. Learning to recognize and appreciate sufficiency, a sufficient income, sufficient health, sufficient peace, is a profound act of psychological maturity. It breaks the cycle of comparison and perpetual striving that defines the earlier years. This shift allows us to finally release the need to catch up or keep pace. We begin to understand that our life timeline is entirely unique, and the metrics of success imposed by our culture are designed to keep us perpetually dissatisfied customers. We step off the treadmill. The quiet strength that emerges from this process is not aggressive or demanding. It is the strength of knowing who you are, what you will tolerate, and what you will absolutely refuse. It is a strength rooted in self-knowledge, forged in the fires of past mistakes, and tempered by the humility of realizing how little we actually control. We come to understand that the true freedom of midlife is the freedom from illusion. We no longer need the fairy tale endings, the dramatic transformations, or the guarantee of success. We seek only reality, because reality, when faced honestly, provides the clearest map for navigation. It is within that clarity that the person in the mirror finally starts to look familiar again. Not the person we were, but the person we were meant to become, stripped bare of all the unnecessary armor. This quiet becoming is the true purpose of this profound second chapter. This quiet becoming is the true purpose of this profound second chapter. When we talk about shedding the unnecessary armor, we are often talking about letting go of the identity we painstakingly constructed during our 20s and 30s. The persona built less for authenticity and more for external approval, safety, and perceived success. We find ourselves carrying the weight of titles, expectations, and comparisons that were never truly ours to begin with. The resulting fatigue, the deep emotional exhaustion so common after 40, is often misunderstood. It is not always the fatigue of overwork, but the sheer, relentless exhaustion of maintaining an obsolete structure. We spent decades trying to fit a specific mold, convinced that if we checked all the boxes, the right job, the stable relationship, the predictable routine, the reward would be automatic, unshakable happiness. But when the dust settles and the checklist is completed, the reward sometimes feels like a hollow echo. The realization hits that the definition of success we adopted was incomplete, perhaps even fundamentally flawed. This discrepancy, the gap between the promised satisfaction and the felt reality, generates a silent kind of grief. It is the mourning of a future we were guaranteed but never received. And because this feeling is internal, because the external life looks perfectly stable, it becomes isolating. We feel guilty for the emptiness. How can I feel lost when I have everything I worked for? This is where the psychological shift becomes necessary and irreversible. We start to trade the pursuit of excitement for the pursuit of meaning. Excitement is high energy, externally dependent, and often fleeting. Meaning is quiet, internally sourced, and sustains us through the long haul. The younger self thrives on peaks and drama. The mature self seeks bedrock and continuity. The internal navigation system changes its metrics entirely. We stop asking, "How can I impress them?" and start asking, "Does this nourish me?" This shift is profound because it necessitates a complete restructuring of our time and energy budget. We suddenly find we have a sharply reduced tolerance for drama, for superficial interactions, and for commitments driven solely by obligation. This is not bitterness or misanthropy, it is resource management. We realize that our attention, our emotional energy, and our available hours are limited, precious commodities. We learn the vital difference between activity and productivity, between moving fast and moving deliberately. This often requires a deep, sometimes painful, reevaluation of our most enduring relationships. People who were once central figures, friends, even family members, may find that the energy exchange has become unbalanced. When we stop performing the old identity, those who relied on that performance sometimes feel betrayed. They miss the person who always said yes, the person who maintained the drama, the person who was always available to fill their needs. Learning to implement boundaries is the language of this resource management. It is often perceived as coldness or withdrawal, but setting a boundary is simply defining where one person ends and another begins. It is an act of clarity, not aggression. It is the mature recognition that while we can be compassionate toward others, we cannot set ourselves on fire to keep someone else warm. This process of culling the unnecessary, of quiet withdrawal from the noise, can lead to a period of genuine loneliness. The social landscape thins out. But this loneliness is productive. It is the necessary space required for the deeper, more complex connections to form. The connections built not on shared history or convenience, but on mutual respect for authentic selfhood. The core challenge in this midlife reassessment is distinguishing between true acceptance and passive resignation. Many people fear that facing reality, acknowledging the limitations of time, energy, and opportunity, will mean giving up entirely. They believe that true growth requires fighting every boundary, denying every defeat, and insisting on the infinite potential they were promised in their youth. But resignation is the surrender of effort, the giving up of agency. Acceptance is the surrender of resistance to what is true. When we accept the present moment, including its disappointments and its constraints, we are not saying, "I quit." We are saying, "I finally understand the lay of the land." This understanding frees up tremendous energy previously wasted in fighting the tides, fighting age, fighting history, fighting the unchangeable aspects of our past choices. For example, accepting that you will likely never become the CEO of a major corporation or that your marriage will never resemble a romantic comedy does not mean you stop working hard or stop loving your partner. It means you stop chasing the fantasy version of those things. Instead, you focus that concentrated energy on maximizing the genuine quality of the life you actually possess. This is the shift from seeking potential to honoring the actual. Potential is an abstract promise. The actual is where meaning resides. The person we see in the mirror after this process begins is often less frantic, less polished, and far less concerned with the opinions of strangers. The lines around the eyes are less about sadness and more about having seen things clearly. The posture may be less aggressive, but the core is stronger, anchored not in external validation, but in internal truth. The deep dissatisfaction that drives this midlife turning point is often a divine discontent, a signal that the infrastructure of our identity is inadequate for the next phase of life. It's a call to rebuild the foundation, brick by quiet brick, based on values that are resilient, sustainable, and entirely our own. We finally learn that the purpose of our life after 40 is not to achieve more, but to understand what we already are, and to live from that place of honest understanding. But this understanding, this deep recognition of what we already are, is rarely a gentle process. It requires the dismantling of the structures we spent decades building. We often interpret the resulting emptiness not as potential space, but immediately as failure. We feel the weight of inertia. It is the exhaustion of the soul recognizing that the map it followed is no longer valid, and perhaps never truly was. The silent frustration we carry is not aimed at a lack of success, but at the sheer, constant energy required to maintain a facade that no longer fits. We are tired of pretending the old goals still hold the same gravity, or that chasing the next peak is worth the climb when the view from the top feels exactly the same as the view from the bottom. What often follows this realization is a period of necessary stagnation. We confuse this deep need to pause with laziness, or sometimes with moral decay. We judge ourselves harshly for slowing down, especially in a culture obsessed with perpetual motion. But true pause is an active state. It is not about doing nothing. It is about allowing the internal system to quiet down enough to hear the faint new instructions. This is the moment when the body and mind insist on decelerating. The body, especially after 40, stops accepting the high-stress, low-meaning fuel we once fed it without complaint. It begins to send insistent signals: physical pain, chronic low energy, unexplained anxiety, forcing us to listen to its underlying needs. This deceleration is profoundly frightening because it puts us instantly out of sync with the external world. We look around, and everyone else seems to be speeding up, climbing harder, accumulating more evidence of their perceived value. This pressure creates enormous internal conflict. We know instinctively that we need to step back, to reflect, to withdraw energy from the performance. Yet stepping back feels like admitting defeat in a race we didn't even want to run anymore. This tension between the undeniable inner truth and the relentless external expectation is precisely where the majority of midlife emotional exhaustion originates. We are trying to serve two masters, the person we are supposed to be and the person we actually are now. The person we are now, after 40, usually values depth over breadth. This person prefers authenticity over approval. But making that shift requires courage, because the rewards of depth are quiet and internal, while the rewards of approval are loud and immediate. We must learn to trust that quiet reward. Clarity is not a sudden flash of insight delivered on a silver platter. It is the slow, dawning realization that the only person we truly have to satisfy is the one staring back from the mirror, and that person, above all else, needs peace, not spectacle. This brings us to the difficult subject of acceptance. When we talk about acceptance in midlife, we must distinguish it carefully from resignation. They look similar on the surface, but their psychological mechanism is opposite. Resignation says, "I give up. I will stop trying because nothing will change." It is passive and laced with defeat. It carries the flavor of bitterness. Acceptance, however, says, "I stop fighting reality." It is active and laced with deep recognition. It is the psychological mechanism that allows us to define boundaries. This is the extent of my effort. This is the limit of my responsibility. This is who I am right now, with all the accumulated disappointments and quiet wisdom. When we accept the present reality, the limitations of our job, the imperfections of our marriage, the fact that some childhood dreams will simply never materialize, we are not passively submitting to fate. We are strategically withdrawing the enormous amount of energy we were spending on denial and resistance. That liberated energy is what we use to build the life that actually fits us. The psychological shift here is profound. For decades, we were taught that happiness was the result of relentless forward motion and acquisition. We believed that if we just pushed hard enough, the dissatisfaction would eventually disappear. In midlife, we realized the dissatisfaction was not a sign we weren't trying hard enough. It was a sign we were trying too hard at the wrong things. The exhaustion is the system's way of enforcing a necessary pause so that we can recalibrate the GPS. We are forced into a period of psychological reevaluation, where we stop asking, "What should I be doing?" and start asking the harder, more honest question, "What is the truth of my experience right now?" The search for purpose after 40 is rarely about finding a new grand mission. It is usually about making peace with the small, crucial missions right in front of us. It is about bringing presence and attention to the routine tasks that define our day. This is where the real work of self-reclamation begins. We look back at the person we were in our 20s, driven, perhaps naive, constantly hustling, and we realize that person was building a life for a future self that doesn't exist anymore. The person we are now has different needs: less noise, more silence, fewer acquaintances, deeper connections, less performance, more being. The internal conflict often involves mourning the loss of the future we had planned, the version of ourselves we were certain we would become. This mourning is critical. We must acknowledge the disappointment fully, rather than sweeping it under the rug of false gratitude or forced optimism. True resilience comes from facing the disappointment head-on and saying, "Yes, that dream died, and now what lives in its place?" We must give ourselves permission to let go of the identity defined by past roles: the perfect employee, the tireless parent, the social butterfly. These roles served their function, but clinging to them now is like trying to wear clothing that is 3 sizes too small. It constricts our breathing and forces an awkward posture. The psychological task is to find the core identity that remains when all those roles are stripped away. Who are you when you are not actively producing, not actively caring for others, not actively climbing? For many, the answer is terrifying stillness. We have been running so long that we forgot how to sit quietly with ourselves. We fear the quiet because we worry about what painful truths might surface. But the truth that surfaces in midlife stillness is rarely painful. It is usually just real. It reminds us that our value is inherent, not earned through perpetual striving. This process of internal realignment profoundly affects our relationships. When we change the metrics of our own success, the dynamics with partners, children, and colleagues shift immediately. If you decide that your success is no longer defined by your income, but by your integrity and peace of mind, you might find that your partner, who relies on the income metric, feels threatened or confused. If you stop trying to be the perfect parent and simply aim to be the present parent, your relationship with your adult children might initially resist the change in dynamic. This requires honest conversation, not only with others, but first and foremost with ourselves. We must articulate, clearly and calmly, the boundaries of our new, quieter self. We must learn to say no without guilt, explaining that the refusal is not a rejection of the other person, but an act of fidelity to our own depleted emotional reserves. The energy drain of midlife is often compounded by the inability to establish and defend these psychological boundaries. We continue to volunteer, continue to overcommit, continue to prioritize external demands over internal needs, driven by a deeply ingrained belief that self-sacrifice equals worthiness. Breaking this cycle requires a deliberate practice of prioritizing self-care, not as an indulgence, but as a non-negotiable requirement for sustainable living after 40. This self-care is not about spa days. It is about managing mental inputs, choosing silence over noise, and prioritizing sleep over late-night productivity. It's the shift from running on adrenaline and external validation to running on deep restorative rest and internal satisfaction. The key psychological challenge is to maintain patience during this transition. Identity is not shed quickly. It peels away in slow, uneven layers. There will be days when the old habits reassert themselves, when the urge to perform or people please is overwhelming. There will be moments of intense doubt, wondering if this quest for meaning is just a sophisticated form of midlife crisis denial. We must treat these moments with gentle observation, not self-criticism. We simply notice the old wiring activating and choose, slowly, deliberately, to route the energy differently. The ultimate goal of this phase is not happiness, which is fleeting, but coherence. Coherence is the alignment between what you believe, what you say, and what you do. When we achieve coherence, we feel anchored. We feel grounded. This anchor is the true source of stability in the second half of life. When we reach this state, the exhaustion starts to lift, not because the demands of the world have disappeared, but because we have stopped fighting ourselves. We have accepted the psychological reality that our capacity is finite, and that living fully means living within those respectful limits. The woman or man looking back from the mirror may not be the person you plan to be, but she or he is finally, honestly, real. And in that reality, there is a quiet, resilient strength that the younger, striving self could never possess. This strength is born from the acceptance of imperfect existence. The strength born from the acceptance of imperfect existence is a quiet power. It is not loud because it no longer needs to declare itself or defend its choices. When we stop the internal fight, the vast energy previously spent on self-reproach, on chasing the next required milestone, or on maintaining the performance of success, is finally liberated. This energy doesn't disappear. It refocuses. It moves from the horizon to the immediate landscape. The ambition of the younger self was often defined by scale, by distance, by how high we could climb. The ambition of the mature self is defined by depth, by integration, by how well we can tend the small patch of life we actually inhabit. We are no longer striving to become someone else. We are finally learning to be the person we already are, refining that reality, accepting its limitations, and finding genuine satisfaction within its honest boundaries. This realization often arrives late, and sometimes it feels like a disappointment. We were promised that if we followed the path, we would arrive at a grand, shimmering conclusion, the finish line where everything makes sense, where the identity is complete and the struggle ends. But the psychological truth of midlife is that there is no arrival. There is only continuous tending. Life is not a series of peaks and valleys that ends in a plateau of perfect calm. It is a garden that requires daily attention, regardless of the weather. The silent frustration that shadows so many people in their 40s and 50s often stems from this realization. I did the work. Where is the promised payoff? The payoff is simply the permission to stop trying to force an outcome that was never meant for you. The payoff is the freedom from the shoulds. We start to define success, not by the applause of the crowd, but by the quiet integrity of our routine. Success becomes the ability to meet the ordinary demands of the day, the emails, the laundry, the difficult conversation, the silent morning, with present awareness and simple competence. We begin to notice the things we previously rushed past. The quality of the light filtering through the window, the satisfying weight of a favorite mug, the quiet rhythm of a relationship that has survived, strain and time. These small, unglamorous components of existence are the psychological anchors. They are immune to market crashes, career shifts, and societal judgment. They are simply real. When we finally see the person in the mirror who has stopped trying to be someone else, we are looking at someone who is rooted. She or he may carry the scars of past mistakes, the lines of hard-won experience, and the weight of unfulfilled dreams. But they also possess a grounded quality that is infinitely more valuable than youthful vigor. We stop fighting the truth of our capacity. We understand that saying no to a new commitment is not a moral failure or a sign of weakness, but a profound act of self-preservation, a recognition of finite energy. This is acceptance, but it is not resignation. Resignation is the act of giving up in defeat, often accompanied by bitterness or cynicism. Acceptance is the act of recognizing reality, setting down the heavy shield of illusion, and choosing to work intelligently with the materials we actually have. It is the mature understanding that sometimes the greatest victory is simply staying healthy, staying kind, and maintaining the small circle of relationships that genuinely matter. The conflicts that once raged internally, the battle between who we were told to be and who we secretly knew we were, begin to dissolve into a settled clarity. We recognize that much of our previous identity was built on performance. We were performing the role of the successful professional, the perfect parent, the tireless friend. The crisis of midlife is often the forced stripping away of that performance, either by external events like career change or by the internal exhaustion that simply refuses to play the part anymore. What remains when the titles and roles are removed? What remains is simply you, defined not by what you do, but by the quality of your attention and the quiet wisdom gleaned from weathering previous storms. This shift from doing to being fundamentally alters our perspective on purpose. Purpose stops being a grand external mission that needs to be chased across continents. It becomes the deep inner commitment to live this moment, right here, right now, with integrity. It is found in the way you listen when someone is speaking, in the care you put into a simple meal, or in the genuine presence you bring to your own solitude. The confusion we feel in midlife, the sense of being lost, is often the discomfort of standing in a space we haven't learned to occupy yet. The space of quiet, non-performing authenticity. It takes time to trust this new version of ourselves, the one who is slower, less ambitious in the traditional sense, and far more discerning about where they spend their precious remaining energy. But in that trust, a profound resilience is built. It is the clarity of realizing that we don't need to be extraordinary to be whole. We only need to be fully, imperfectly, present. And when we look into the mirror now, perhaps the person looking back is not the energetic young stranger we remember, but someone far more reliable. The person who finally came home,